you were involved in the movie project with Ben Stein, Expelled,
Right.
with the issue of intelligent design. And we have this enormous prejudice out there against any consideration of ID, as we said. What do you think motivates that negative response?
Well, partly what you just said, when people are uncomfortable with their own intellectual position or when they don't fully understand the basis of it, there's a kind of insecurity that ensues. It's one of the things that attracted Ben Stein to the project when he learned about the case of Richard Sternberg at the Smithsonian Institution and how he'd been treated. He in the super trailer to the film, he said, in my experience, this is not the way people who are confident in their intellectual position act. And when he saw these cases of suppression, of retribution being enacted against very competent scientists, that to him, as a non-scientist, but as a very shrewd guy, was an indicator that the people defending the Darwinian orthodoxy were actually insecure about their position. You don't resort to power if you can instead provide a compelling counter-argument. And so I think that's part of it. There's this sociological dimension, this sense that all reasonable people agree, and we're not sure why, but all reasonable people agree. Therefore, if you dissent, you're not reasonable by definition, and you have to be suppressed or excluded.
There's also an antipathy and hostility there towards Christianity, and a fear that ID will introduce.
People don't like where it's leading. Is
that's right.
The way
and they don't want that.
Yeah.
But there's also what I have seen is a fundamental fear of the intrusion of philosophy into the scientific realm. And when I look at this as a philosopher, I have to smile a little bit because the scientific community's it's pervaded with naturalism.
Well,
and naturalism is a philosophy.
Exactly. The Darwinian establishment's doing philosophy and in a very bad way. The way it works. First, comment about, back to just revisiting your first question about what's driving this. I have a friendly debating partner, Michael Ruse, who's a committed Darwinist, but a genuine good guy and very congenial. And Michael and I have squared off a number of times, but he's written a very important book in which he explains that Darwinism has functioned for many scientists as a kind of secular religion. Right. And the commitment that is manifested in some of these expelled-like cases is a kind of almost fanatical zeal. And I think it's typical of what happens to people. It's the human condition when you have fundamentally, or when you have deeply held personal beliefs that are challenged by evidence that you don't know how to respond to. Very often, if any person's in that situation, they respond emotionally, sometimes somewhat irrationally, sometimes by resorting to power rather than persuasion.
Yes.
That's human nature, and I think that's part of what's driving the extreme hostility that we find now in the Darwinian community as it's directed to against people like Richard Sternberg or Guillermo Gonzalez or any number of the others whose cases were documented in the film Expelled.
Well, Stephen, you've dropped a bombshell on the playground of the scientists with your book and the signature in the cell, which speaks of the relationship of, I guess, molecular biology with intelligent design. Can you tell us a little bit about the central thesis of that?
Yeah, sure. I wrote the book in 2007 and got it out in 2009. But I'd been stewing on it for a long time. The idea for it is kind of embarrassing, but my son was a year old and I finished it when he was 18 as a senior in high school. But I got interested in the mid-'80s in what I call in the book the DNA enigma, the mystery of the origin of the information that's necessary to build life. And I became interested in this because I attended a conference in the mid-'80s that had a huge seminar in the middle of it on the origin of life problem with some world-class people in the field. And I had a double major in science as an undergraduate. I was working as a geophysicist, and I was under the impression that the evolutionary biologists had this question all sewn up. And I was shocked to realize that some of the top people in the field, I mean almost all, acknowledged that the field of origin of life research is what it's called, was the field was in a state of complete impasse, and that the fundamental question that was tripping up the scientists trying to account for the origin of life was the origin of the information that's encoded in DNA. It's one thing to do these experiments and build these chemicals, get them to arise through undirected chemical interactions. It's quite another to get the chemical constituents of the key molecules in life, like the DNA and the proteins and the RNA, to line up in the right way, to become sequenced or arranged to store information. And what we now know about life is that information runs the show inside the cell. I used to ask my students a question: if you want to give your computer a new function, what do you have to give it? And they would know right away. They're under 40, the information, code, software. Well, the same thing is true in life. If you want to build a new form of life from a simpler pre-existing form, you've got to have instructions inside the cell to build the proteins and the protein parts you need for those new parts of new forms of life. Same thing is true if you want to build life in the first place. You've got to have information in the DNA molecule. And so that's the fundamental question that I addressed in the book. And I argued that that intelligent design, in fact, provides a solution to that mystery.
When you think about all that information that's there and impacted in the least of these elements, I can't help but go back to Aristotle and think the same thing. Aristotle's theory of the entelechy. I don't know if you ever counted that.
The purpose for which something is made.
Yeah, so that's why an acorn becomes an oak tree and not an elephant.
Right.
That it's already inside. There's an entelechy, an intelligence within that, encoded, to make sure that acorn doesn't become a kangaroo or
and what he would have given to know about the molecular biological revolution.
Exactly.
Because there's the Greeks were fascinated with form and the origin of form.
Right.
And we now know that at the root of the origin of form is information. And this was the key discovery in the 1950s. We all know about the discovery of Watson and Crick and the famous double helix structure of DNA. But 4 or 5 years later, Crick put forward a brilliant hypothesis. It was called the sequence hypothesis. And it was subsequently confirmed. And Crick had the insight to realize that along the spine of the DNA molecule there are 4 chemicals, and that these 4 chemicals are functioning just like alphabetic characters in a written language or digital characters in a machine code, which is to say it's not the chemical or physical properties of those chemicals, they're called the bases, but rather it's their sequential arrangement that gives them their function. Just like Scrabble letters. It's not the little plastic in the letter that is important. It's if you get the letters arranged right to spell a word and land on that triple word score. It's the sequential arrangement that's key to function. And this was, I think, the most important insight of modern biology. And then it was subsequently confirmed, and it sparked the whole molecular biological revolution, which was essentially the realization that information is running the show inside life. We're having an information revolution in our high-tech world. But it's almost uncanny that at about the same time we're inventing this high-tech information technology, we've also discovered it inside life, even in the very simplest cells. And information, therefore, is really the key.
Is anybody in these days brutish enough to deny the obvious presence of design?
Well, of course there are folks, and I'm encountering them all the time on the internet and in various reviews, but I think that the tide in this debate is beginning to shift, because most people, and I mean high-tech people, scientists, recognize the connection between information and intelligence.
Right.
I was standing on the soccer
but
sidelines.
I wasn't asking about intelligent design, just
well, design.